Good morning, and I hope you can all hear me. I can see the uptick in attendees. We're now at 105, so I'm just going to take 1 second to make sure that everyone has their video on, that they can hear me okay, and we'll get started. Okay, I can see everything looks green and for go and red for recording on this end. So hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. As many of you know, and I'm very, very happy to see so many familiar names are on our attendees list and clicking into the presentation. I'm Ann Benedetti. I'm a partner in our municipal and planning law group here at Goodmans. And I'm the moderator today. So on behalf of myself, Rob Howe, Max Laskin, and Matthew Lakatos Hayward, and our team, including Sandra and Lindsay, we want to welcome you to this presentation. Today, we're going to be talking about Bill 197. It has a scarier name, the COVID-19 Economic Recovery Act, so we'll call it Bill 197. And what we're really going to be speaking about today is a rethink of developer contributions. Sandra, if you wouldn't mind taking us to the next slide. So when we were preparing for this presentation, I couldn't stop thinking about whether it's a famous quote, a famous curse, whether you attribute it to Prime Minister Chamberlain, President Kennedy, or Secretary Clinton, and that is, may you live in interesting times. And we're definitely here. I thought we were here just in our own development community. And so if you didn't believe that from 2017 to now, it's definitely the case now. So we definitely live in interesting times. But the good news is we're living through them together. And our goal here is to hopefully take some of what has become a bit of a roller coaster around developer contributions, provide you with a roadmap, give you some interesting discussion points on that. So as many of you know, because we've been living through it together, this roller coaster in development law has been going on for a long time, but we're just going to start with a reminder from December 2017, Bill 139. As you recall, it did a lot more than just rename the Ontario Municipal Board. We had, for a certain amount of time, we were dealing with potentially 2 hearings, numerous tests, different frameworks, evidence, no evidence, written evidence, giant packages of information to be filing with any appeals to the now named LPAT. As we now know, as of June 2019, that is in our past, further to Bill 108. We appreciate that many of the names I see on this list also joined us for a presentation we gave on Bill 108, the 2019 Housing Supply Action Plan, where we talked about, obviously, it was much more than just a return to the former OMB process and what we're going to build on from that presentation. And if you'll recall, Rob Howe was part of that panel as well and discussed the community benefits charge and development financing implications. And what people who have been living through this, as we all have, will recall with Bill 108 is it proposed the community benefits charge, the idea that our Section 37 contributions, soft DCs, and also Parkland dedication contributions were somehow going to be put together into a CBC, and there was going to be a value set. And of course, it remained a mystery. We then saw some regulations in February of this year. And now we have Bill 197. And what Bill 197 has done is amend numerous statutes. And we're going to talk about a few of them with a focus on the Planning Act and the Development Charges Act. So Sandra, could you take us to the next slide if you have a sec? So very topical. It was introduced July 8th, 2020. Actually, as people on this panel know, royal assent was literally given when we were all together discussing this presentation. So it has been given royal assent. Certain provisions are already in force. And as people will realize, it amends numerous statutes. Sorry, I just had a pop-up come up on my screen. It amends the Planning Act, as we'll discuss, Development Charges Act, the Environmental Assessment Act, the Building Code, Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing Act, the Municipal Act, the City of Toronto Act, and the reasonably new, obviously, Transit-Oriented Communities Act. So without further ado, you want to hear more from the panelists and less from me. So there's me, I'm your moderator. As I mentioned, Rob Howe will be leading the discussion on the community benefits charge, Parkland dedication, and soft service DCs. And for any of you who've had a chance to work with Rob, not only does he have a broad ranging practice in municipal and land use planning, he has an extreme level of expertise in development financing, from cost sharing agreements to DCs. And if many of you were at one of the Build annual events, Rob had a massive win on DC bylaws representing Build, and you may remember him from the Build movie, which I personally loved. So Rob will be leading us through development charges, Parkland, and soft service DCs. Max Laskin. Max is a senior associate with us. If you haven't worked with Max yet, you are absolutely in for a treat. He is an exceptional lawyer. He's becoming one of the backbones of our section. He's both participating in and now leading many of our infill development files with you. And he will be speaking about ministerial zoning orders. And we look forward to hearing from Max. We're very excited to introduce you to Matthew. Matthew Lakatos Hayward has joined us last year, where he was working for originally an environmental boutique. So he has a really important expertise for us, where he has worked in environmental litigations and regulatory matters, and is expanding his expertise into land use planning. And as you know, and many of you also work with Kate Lyons at Goodmans, Matthew is able to provide that overlap between those two areas, and he'll be speaking to us about environmental assessments. So I'm just going to check my notes to make sure I haven't missed anything. And then that's what it is. I need to talk to my actual moderating duties. So we want to hear from you. The goal is we're living in these interesting times together, and our goal is to both hopefully inform you, but also to have discussion. And to work through these items together. So in the digital world, I'm sure this is your 500th Zoom, Google Chat, Skype, Teams meeting, probably even of today. But we're gonna be available, and I will be receiving your questions in pretty much any media. You can raise your hand. As you know, that will put a little symbol beside your participant name, so I'll know you have a question. There's a chat box, so feel free to type a question. I'll be keeping my eye out for those. And also, there is actually a question and answer panel. You can put your name. We know many of you, and sometimes that helps us because it gives us some insight into the background of your question. Or also feel free to put a question in anonymously. What we're going to try to do is to go through the presentations so that each item can proceed, and we don't, because we do anticipate that there may be some questions for Rob, and we want to make sure that we get through all the pieces. So if you don't mind, I will be holding questions. If there are some questions where they can just be quickly addressed, or I can let you know a reference, I will. But that is the plan. So without further ado, I'm going to turn you over to Rob Howe. Thanks, Rob.
Okay, thanks very much, Anne. So as Anne said, I'm going to talk about developer contributions. And I'm going to start, before I get to Bill 197, I'm going to start with a recap of what was proposed in Bill 108, so we can focus on and try to clearly understand what changes have been proposed by the new legislation. So the main feature I'm going to focus on is the community benefits charge, which we lovingly refer to now as the CBC. And it's a new authority that allowed municipalities to impose a new charge to pay for capital costs of services, facilities, or matters that are required because of development or redevelopment. So there was always a requirement that this new charge pay for services or things that somehow were related to development. But primarily it was intended to replace 3 types of developer contributions with a single charge. And those are firstly parkland dedication, secondly contributions under Section 37 of the Planning Act, which, as you probably know, allowed municipalities to grant increases in height and density in exchange for financial contributions or services by developers. And thirdly, the CVC was intended to replace soft service development charges, including DCs for things like parkland improvements, community centers, arenas, libraries, daycares, and so on. One of the important features of the new authority was that CVCs were to be capped based on a percentage of land value, or the value of the land that was to be developed, and those percentage caps were to be set out in regulations. So the amendments to the Planning Act and the Development Charges Act that would have implemented the CVC regime were enacted in June 2019, but the amendments have not yet been brought into force. Sorry, I think I was muted there for a second. Am I okay now? All right. Sandra, can we move to the next slide, please? Okay, so I'm going to start with the parkland dedication. So as part of rolling parkland dedication into the CVC, a few things resulted. Firstly, the alternative parkland rates were to be deleted from the Planning Act. And by alternative parkland rates, I of course mean the option that municipalities had to require parkland dedication at the rates of 1 hectare per 300 units for conveyances and 1 hectare for 500 units for cash in lieu. And those are, we call those the alternative rates because they are alternative to the base parkland rates of 2% of land developed for commercial or industrial uses and 5% for residential or any other type of use. The second important feature or change that resulted from rolling parkland dedication into the CVC was that existing parkland dedication bylaws would have no effect once the CVC bylaw is enacted. And the municipality could, so the effect was that the municipality through the CVC could collect money for parkland acquisition. But once the new regime or the new authority came into effect, the municipality could only get conveyances of parkland in 2 ways. Firstly, a landowner and a municipality could agree that land could be dedicated as an in-kind contribution in exchange for a credit against the CVC that would otherwise be payable. Yes. And secondly, the municipality could still impose a requirement to convey parkland or pay cash in lieu of parkland as a condition of draft plan approval or consent, but only at the base rates of 2% and 5%. But if a parkland dedication condition was imposed in respect of a plan of subdivision or consent, the CVC would not apply. So that's parkland dedication. So section 37. So the CVC would also replace municipalities' ability to require developer contributions in exchange for increases in height and density under section 37 of the Planning Act. The government indicated that this change was intended to provide greater certainty at the outset of the development process and also to provide more consistency between how developer contributions were extracted from competing development proposals. And the language used at the time was that the province was proposing to do away with what's been called let's make a deal planning. So the third major category changed by the CVC were soft service development charges. So the idea was that most soft services would no longer be funded by development charges, and instead they would be funded through the CVC. And what the Bill 108 provided was that there was going to be a more restricted list of services that could remain in the DC, and they would focus mostly on what we come to think of as the hard services. So water, sewers and roads, storm sewers, electrical, power services, police, ambulance, and fire protection, transit services, waste diversion, and the province gave itself the ability to prescribe additional services in regulations as well. Bill 108 also made some other important changes to development charges. Firstly, the DC would generally be calculated based on rates in effect at the time of site plan or rezoning application, as opposed to the date of payment. Although they would be subject to the payment of interest rates chosen by the municipalities. And what we've actually found since that legislation has came into effect in January is that many municipalities are simply charging high enough interest rates to recover any shortfall in having the DCs calculated early. So it was an intended change that may not have had much of an effect on the actual quantum of development charges that landowners are paying. Secondly, the Bill 108 provided for the phased payment of development charges for rental housing, institutional development, and nonprofit housing. It was originally proposed to also apply to commercial and industrial development, but those provisions were removed from the legislation in December. And finally, Bill 108 would have removed the requirement that municipalities fund 10% of growth-related capital costs for soft services. And this was an issue that municipalities have complained about for years, and the province was finally proposing to remove that requirement from the Development Charges Act. So as I indicated earlier, the quantum of DCs was to be, or CVCs was to be capped based on a percentage of land value to be set out in regulations. And in February 2020, the province released for consultation a regulation proposal that set out what it was considering in terms of those land value caps. The total cap that was proposed was 15% of land value, and that would have applied in single-tier municipalities like Toronto, Hamilton, Ottawa, or Barrie. But in municipalities with two-tier government, the cap was to be split, with 5% being allocated to the upper-tier municipality and 10% being allocated to the lower-tier municipality. In response to that regulation proposal, the province received a lot of comments, and which also raised continuing concerns that municipalities and developers had about the legislation itself. So what's happened since February? Bill 197. So this is the regime proposed for community benefits charges under Bill 108. And we can move to the next slide. So this is now a schematic of what's now proposed in respect of CVCs under Bill 197. So instead of finalizing the regulations and bringing Bill 108, the Bill 108 provisions regarding CVCs into force, the province instead decided to make major changes to the Bill 108 provisions with the enactment of Bill 197. And what it does is it backtracks on many of the legislative changes to developer contributions that were originally proposed in Bill 108. And in terms of the CVC, it now really only replaces the former Section 37 contribution regime. In terms of parkland dedication, Bill 197 essentially unwinds the Bill 108 amendments that were proposed to parkland dedication and cash in lieu. And under Bill 197, the enactment of a CBC bylaw would no longer render parkland dedication bylaws to be unenforceable. And importantly, the alternative parkland rates are reinstated back into the Planning Act. So those rates of 1 hectare of parkland per 300 residential units for conveyances, and 1 hectare of parkland for 500 residential units for cash in lieu are being put back into the Planning Act. Next slide. So the province is proposing, in unwinding those changes, the province is proposing to address the development industry concerns regarding parkland dedication in a different way. And what Bill 197 does is that it provides a new right to appeal parkland dedication bylaws that would permit the use of the alternative rates. And that appeal goes to the LPAT. All existing parkland dedication bylaws that include alternative rates will expire 2 years after Bill 197 comes into effect. And that's intended to provide developers an opportunity to file appeals in respect of the use of alternative parkland dedication rates in all municipalities throughout the province. Conditions of draft plan approval requiring parkland dedication or cash in lieu at alternative rates can continue to be imposed and remain subject to appeal also to LPAT. And these changes, I think, are really a recognition by the province that it was really struggling with its one-size-fits-all approach to a fix on parkland dedication, and also the fact that it got a lot of pushback from municipalities. And so what we're left with is the ability to file appeals of parkland dedication bylaws to LPAT, although I think it remains to be seen how those appeals will be used, because the province isn't really providing any guidance to the LPAT in terms of how it should make a decision in respect of alternative parkland rates, or what kind of direction it should give municipalities in terms of alternative parkland rates. And some of you may recall a few years ago, there was a decision in respect of the Richmond Hill official plan and the parkland dedication policies in that official plan. And in that case, the OMB decided that the town's OP should contain caps on the use of the alternative parkland rate as it applies to high density development. The courts overturned that decision by the OMB on the basis that the board did not have any jurisdiction to provide direction to municipalities as to how its alternative parkland rate should be used. And this new right of appeal in Bill 197 in regard to municipalities' parkland dedication bylaws will essentially now give the LPAT that jurisdiction that the court said it didn't have in relation to the Richmond Hill Parkland case. So moving on now to development charges. So the province has essentially now shifted soft services back into the development charge. Not in the sort of very general way that it did pre-Bill 108, because originally the municipality could fund through development charges any service that it could demonstrate was attributable to the needs of new development. But what the province has now done is they've put a prescribed list of the services that can be funded by DCs, and that was proposed in Bill 108. But what they're now proposing is that it be expanded to essentially include the full range of soft services that municipalities traditionally funded through development charges, including soft services. And so you'll see on the slide that we've got two lists, two columns. So this idea of expanding the range of services that municipalities could fund through development charges to include soft services was originally proposed in the February 2020 regulation proposal. And you'll see originally there was a list that included sort of the main categories of soft services that municipalities funded through development charges: libraries, long-term care, park development, recreational facilities, public health, and childcare. And now through Bill 197, that list has been extended to include housing services, provincial offense proceedings, emergency preparedness, and airports in Waterloo region. So there's very little in the way of development charge, of soft services that were traditionally funded by development charges that would be excluded going forward from being included in the DC. There's a few minor categories like parking, but you know, essentially soft services have been shifted back into the development charge. So if we can have the next slide, please. Bill 197, so while soft services are being shifted back into the development charge, Bill 197 does not reinstate the requirement that municipalities fund 10% of the growth-related capital costs itself. And the effect of that is that the development charges for most soft services will increase by 10%. And Bill 197 does not change other amendments to the Development Charges Act that were introduced through Bill 108 that have been in effect since January, including the freeze on DC rates as of the date of site plan or rezoning application, and the provisions for the phased development of DCs for affordable housing, nonprofit housing, and institutional projects.
Rob, can I just ask you a quick question that came in just in regard to the previous slide 18? What are housing services? Just can we get a quick clarification on housing services?
Yeah, I think
Thanks.
the intention there would be social housing and affordable housing. Some municipalities, York Region, the City of Toronto, those are two that I can think of for sure, funded affordable housing and social housing programs through development charges. So that is what I believe the government intends by including housing services in the list of services that can be funded by the development charge.
Thanks, Rob. That's great.
So then, in terms of the community benefits charge, it remains, and Bill 197 retains that CBC authority, but with obviously a narrower scope. Because it's pushed soft service development charges back into the DC and Parkland dedication back into the traditional provisions of the Planning Act. So the CBC now effectively only replaces Section 37 of the Planning Act. It will continue to be subject to a cap based on a percentage of land value, but the proposed caps have not yet been released by the province. I think we're expecting something from the province in the coming weeks on that. There isn't a specific time frame. I would note that BUILD has made a submission to the province proposing a 2% cap as appropriate to replace Section 37. And just a final note in respect of the CBC authority, as with Bill 1, well, the province amended Bill 108 in December to provide a right to appeal CBC bylaws to the LPAT, and that remains in the legislation under Bill 197. There will continue to be an opportunity for developers to provide in-kind contributions to municipalities in exchange for effectively a credit against the CBC. And that effectively has to happen through agreement between the developer and the municipality. And there's a specific provision now that says that the municipality has to provide the landowner with the valuation it intends to use before the contribution is made. So again, it has to be made by agreement, but the municipality has to first tell the developer how much of a credit they're going to get by providing the in-kind contribution. One interesting provision to note is that CBCs can expressly fund the services that can be funded by DCs, or the service categories, I should say, that can be funded by DCs. And the CBC can also fund land for park or other public recreational purposes. However, there's a provision in Bill 197 that says that the capital costs that the municipality includes in its CBC cannot overlap with the cost that it is intended to fund through its DC or its cash in lieu account. So how this will work is a bit unclear, but there is that ability for municipalities to fund soft services and a full range of soft services and Parkland through the CBC. Bill 197 provides for some important new restrictions, though, on the application of CBCs. So firstly, they cannot be imposed by upper tier municipalities anymore. They can only be imposed by single or lower tier municipalities. So that's the first restriction. The second restriction is that CBCs can no longer be funded on certain types of development. So they can't be imposed on certain types of development. So they can't be imposed on a development that is fewer than 5 stories, which means that it effectively wouldn't apply to ground-related development. And it also the CBC can't be applied to a development that has fewer than 10 residential units. And what that means is that it can't be imposed on lower density development, nor can it be imposed on non-residential buildings.
Rob, can I just get a clarification further to a question? And that question is, can the CBC include other growth-related costs provided there is no double dipping with the DCs or Parkland and subject to the cap? Have I said that in a way that makes sense to you?
That succinctly describes what can be funded through the CBC and how it relates to DCs and Parkland dedication.
Okay, thanks. And thanks for that question.
Yeah. So then finally, in terms of transition, the existing Section 37 provisions of the Planning Act that permit municipalities to grant density bonuses in exchange for financial contributions or services, those remain in effect during a 2-year transition period, which will end on the earlier of the end of the 2 years or the date that the municipality passes its first CBC bylaw. And secondly, in respect of properties that are subject to an existing Section 37 bylaw that requires the provision of contributions in exchange for increases in height and density, those bylaws will remain in force even after the CBC bylaw is enacted. And those properties that are subject to a Section 37 bylaw cannot be subject to a CBC unless the municipality repeals the Section 37 bylaw. So that's CBCs, and happy to answer any questions you might have at the end of Max and Matthew's presentations.
Thanks, Rob. It's like popcorn over here, guys. We appreciate all the questions that are coming up in the chat and the questions. So I tried to, where it was possible and it fit into Rob's flow, to kind of address a couple that fit through. But as Rob noted, and I think I've probably messaged most of you, and I've got a couple more to address. We'll address them after we hear from Max and Matthew. So Max, I'll turn it over to you and MZOs.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you, Rob. Good morning, everyone. As Anne noted at the outset, I'm going to talk briefly about ministerial zoning orders, or MZOs, and the ways in which Bill 197 broadens the powers the province can exercise through these orders. As many of you likely know, existing provisions of the Planning Act empower the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing to exercise zoning powers that typically reside with the municipality. When the minister wishes to do so, it can make an order known as a ministerial zoning order, or MZO, setting out zoning permissions that would, in the normal course, be found in a municipally enacted zoning bylaw. These MZOs are generally not required to conform with provincial policy, such as the growth plan or municipal official plans. Such orders are deemed under the Planning Act to be a bylaw passed by the municipality, and the MZO prevails over any other zoning bylaws that are in force. This MZO power has existed for a long time, but has traditionally been seldom used. For example, between 2011 and 2018, only a single zoning order was issued as far as I can tell. In contrast, this provincial government has shown a somewhat greater willingness to use MZOs. In 2020 alone, 7 MZOs have already been made by my count. Within this context, the changes in Bill 197 expand the scope of the matters the minister can address in an MZO in 2 important respects. The first is site plan approval, and the second is inclusionary zoning or affordable housing. Sandra, if you could go to the next slide. So first, with respect to site plan approval, Bill 197 extends the MZO power 1 level down in the planning process effectively, from previously only dealing with zoning to now also dealing with site plan approval. In particular, new provisions in the Planning Act introduced through Bill 197 provide that the minister may exempt lands from the municipal site plan approval process and instead require the landowner to enter into an agreement with the municipality covering much of what is typically addressed through site plan approval. Now, if the matters addressed in this new form of agreement are the same as those addressed in a typical site plan process, you might ask why this change matters. The answer relates to the fact the province has given itself supervisory control over these site plan agreements. In particular, the minister has the power to direct the contents of such an agreement, and those directions are binding. If the agreement does not comply with the minister's direction, the agreement is of no force in effect to the extent of that non-compliance. So putting this all together, this new aspect of the MZO power gives the minister the discretion to supervise the site plan approval process that it did not previously have. And in doing so, the province can step in and take some control over that site plan process away from municipalities and give it to itself where it wishes to do so. The second key way in which the MZO power has been expanded is that the minister now has the explicit authority to impose requirements to deliver affordable housing units through inclusionary zoning as part of an MZO. To implement the affordable housing obligation imposed, the minister can require the owner to either enter into an agreement with the municipality or with the ministry itself, specifying matters such as the depth of affordability, duration of affordability, any incentives to be provided, and the like. Further, whereas municipalities may only apply inclusionary zoning in certain areas, specifically major transit station areas or development permit system areas, the minister is not so constrained. It can apply this inclusionary zoning or affordable housing obligation through an MZO in any geographic area. That is, except for a few. Sandra, if you could go to the next slide for me, please. The new expanded MZO powers that I just spoke about regarding both site plan approval and inclusionary zoning can only be applied outside of the areas listed here. The Greenbelt Plan area, the Oak Ridges Moraine Conservation Plan area, and the Niagara Escarpment Plan area. In all other areas, the minister is entitled to apply MZOs, taking control over the site plan process in the manner that I described, and imposing affordable housing obligations.
Thanks, Max. So Max, just a quick question for me on that last one. Why do you think those areas have been noted as areas that where new expanded MZO powers can only be outside of those areas?
I don't know in particular, Anne, but I do know that the province early on in its tenure received some political blowback from proposed changes that some perceived as threatening the Greenbelt Plan. And so I suspect these geographic limitations were imposed to sort of protect against any allegations along those lines and make clear that it was only in sort of the more urban areas or non-protected areas in which these MZOs could be applied by the province.
Okay, so thanks, Max. That actually provides a bit of a transition. We're going to move into the environmental section, and we're so happy to introduce you to Matthew. So Matthew, if you could take it away in our discussion of Bill 197 and environmental assessments.
Thanks very much, Anne. So I'm going to be addressing perhaps something that's running parallel to the planning process, but which certainly intersects at various points, and that's the environmental assessment framework by which projects are approved and in which environmental impacts are assessed. And now the province is proposing several major legislative changes as a part of this, what it's calling a modernization of the environmental assessment regime. And the province's comments on this sort of fit into various different buckets of what I'm going to call themes here, namely that the amendments will reduce duplication between this process and the planning process, reduce timelines for which projects can get up and running, and really only focus and prioritize projects with significant environmental effects. But on top of that, there's sort of a fourth bucket of themes that perhaps is unintentional or at least not discussed by the province, and that's that there's more to come. A lot of what these amendments are doing is providing the government with a framework at a later point to come up with regulations and define further what the process is going to look like. And this can best be seen with the government's amendments and changes to the class environmental assessment approach. Sandra, next slide, please. So just as a bit of a background, the class environmental assessment process essentially allowed the minister to approve a process and various studies that would be required for different types of projects with routine and predictable environmental effects. There's currently 10, including, I'm sure people are familiar with the municipal Class EA. And as long as the particular project follows that Class EA document, then the project is pre-approved. Now, the minister has some additional discretion or residual discretion to require an individual environmental assessment for a project that would normally be a class environmental assessment, which would impose various rigorous requirements. And that could be requested by a third party for various reasons in what was frequently and colloquially known as a bump up request. Now, this entire framework here is scheduled to be repealed and replaced ultimately with this new system called a streamlined EA. And because it's replacing the Class EAs, the intent here is that there's going to be no more of them. And it's going to, instead of applying to projects that the minister has approved, it's going to be instead a list that's set out in regulations at a later point in time. This list as well, kind of in the same vein as this more to come bucket, we don't yet know either what the actual process and the studies that will be required for these projects, as the studies and the procedural requirements are also going to be set out in regulations. So this streamlined EA is going to be very much based on what is going to be set out in subsequent regulations at a later point in time. But there is one change that we do know is coming for streamlined EA, and that's the amendments to the bump up request. The minister the minister is proposing, or well, Bill 197 is proposing changes that will allow the minister to require what is going to now be called a comprehensive environmental assessment for projects, but they can only do so within a certain time, and that time is going to be set out in a regulation. And importantly, third parties will no longer be able to make bump up requests unless the bump up request is necessary to mitigate some adverse impact to Indigenous rights that are set out under the Constitution Act 1982. And it's pretty clear that the minister is trying to do this to reduce timelines for projects. Historically, the minister rarely, if ever, grants bump up requests and would only do so to impose conditions. But when a bump up request comes in, it can often delay projects by months, if not years. And so that at least sets out why the minister is doing why he is. Next slide, please, Sandra. Now, this whole streamlined EA process is not coming in right away. It's going to be ultimately phased in part because it relies so heavily on subsequent regulations that are upcoming. And in the meantime, while that is happening, the existing Class EA process is going to continue to apply to undertakings until a later point when the province repeals them. Next slide, please, Sandra. And it's still an open question as to when that is exactly happening, but kind of going hand in hand with these amendments in Bill 197, the minister is also considering amendments to various Class EA documents, including the municipal Class EA. These amendments at least suggest, it's sort of a sidebar, but it suggests at least that these Class EA documents may be around for some time, or maybe even incorporated into the new regulations. And I say that because some of these amendments in the Class EA documents appear to support the government's goals of reducing duplication and reducing timelines. One of these examples in the municipal Class EA is a recategorization of projects. And so there were different, under the municipal Class EA, there were different processes and documents that were required to be put forward for an environmental assessment, depending on what project was exactly being brought forward. So for example, a Schedule C or a Schedule B project required very rigorous studies to be conducted, public consultation, and environmental study report to be prepared, whereas a Schedule A project would be considered pre-approved. Now, one of these amendments, for example, is that collector and arterial roads that were required as a condition of development approval are being downgraded, downshifted from what was previously a Schedule C or Schedule B project down to a Schedule A. And this appears to be done at least because these projects were being subject to an additional Class EA process in addition to already having gone through LPAT or the development approvals process. The amendments to the municipal Class EA and amendments that are set out in Bill 197 are really only one part of this modernization framework, though. Next slide, please, Sandra. As the government is also proposing to change what is called the individual EA framework as well. This new framework is going to look similar in some respects to the individual EA. It's going to require the same levels of study and public consultation. But what will largely be the difference is that what projects it's going to apply to. And so just as a bit of background, the individual EA process previously cast a pretty wide net on which projects were considered undertakings and therefore required an EA. Generally, all public sector projects, plans, processes that were not subject to the Class EA process required an individual EA. Certain private sector undertakings such as landfilling, generator projects, transmission lines also required an EA because they were designated in regulation. And the minister had the power to issue orders that exempted certain undertakings from this individual EA requirement. And this created this rather complicated application where essentially all public sector projects were in unless they were specifically out, and all private sector projects were out unless they were specifically in. Next slide, please. Now that's a little complicated for sure. So what the minister is proposing with this new comprehensive EA framework is that it's going to be a shift to only projects that are set out in a subsequent regulation and a project list. And this appears to fit within the bucket of only requiring EAs for projects with significant environmental effects. And as a transitionary matter, like the Class EA process, this is going to be phased in slowly over time. And so we know that there's sort of more to come on this, as the minister had also talked about reducing timelines for individual EAs from 6 years down to 3 years. And that appears to be going to be set out in some subsequent regulation at a later point in time. So these amendments that are set out in Bill 197 are really only a starting point it's really only a conversation beginning on how the AA process is going to impact the development in Ontario today. Thank you.
Thanks, Matthew. We've got some great questions that have come in, so keep them coming. I'll try to juggle them as we're answering questions. Matthew, just before we leave you, and I think you've actually said it in the last piece of your discussion. So if I'm a developer, I'm going forward with my subdivision requires me to have a building, build a bridge over a small creek, something that I would normally say, yep, that's a municipal class EA. I would open that document. I would work with my consultants. As of now, is that what I do? And I'm just waiting to hear what will happen with the various changes you're discussing?
Yes, the Class EA process is essentially continuing at this point until at a later point, whenever the government decides it's going to bring in this new streamlined EA. So we can see that there's probably going to be a lot of regulations that are being proposed in maybe the next coming months or years, in which will maybe incorporate some of those requirements, maybe not. So potentially the bridge that you may be required to build as a condition of subdivision approval may be subject to a streamlined EA. It may not be. That's sort of up in the air at the moment.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Thanks everyone for the questions that are coming in at this point. So we're going to be spending time on questions on Rob's presentation. So if you've got a burning question on DCs, CBCs, etc., just continue to keep them coming. Rob, I'm going to start with a question, and you've probably seen it. It's going to be the first question we received in the question and answer. And it's talking about the ability to appeal Parkland bylaws. So it's talking about the fact, as you mentioned, that the new bylaws can be appealed. And is there anything, the question is there anything in the regulations that speaks to what happens when a new Parkland bylaw is inevitably appealed?
The short answer is no, although we don't have the regulations yet, but the legislation doesn't really contemplate regulations that are going to govern what happens once a Parkland bylaw is appealed, or if a Parkland bylaw is appealed. I don't think the province is intending to provide any further guidance to the LPAT, as I mentioned, in terms of how it will deal with appeals of Parkland dedication bylaws. The one thing that's actually set out in the legislation, though, is that if a Parkland bylaw is under appeal and a developer makes a conveyance of, is required to make a conveyance of Parkland while the appeal is outstanding, then if the rates of dedication go down based on a successful appeal of the bylaw to LPAT, then the developer is entitled to be compensated through a cash payment for the difference between the land that it should have been required to convey and the land that it actually did convey.
Okay, thanks, Rob. There are actually two questions that I'm hoping I can combine, Rob. One just came in and one we've had. And it talks about when our under Bill 197, are DC rates still frozen at a certain milestone in the approval process? And we had a similar question. Do the DC rates, if it's a zoning bylaw, is there a freeze when it's zoning bylaw or zoning bylaw and SPA? And there was also a question around interest. And I think you posed it well. Municipalities are using interest to simply claw back any loss they may have had due to a freeze. So right. The question is around, when does a freeze happen? What happens with interest and related to applications?
The freeze happens based on the earlier of the application for site plan approval or the application for rezoning. So if development doesn't require a site plan approval application, then it's frozen as of the date of the application of for the zoning bylaw amendment. What happens about interest? Interest is payable from the date the application is made until the DC is paid. And as we've seen in Toronto, municipalities have complete autonomy to decide what those interest rates are going to be.
I'm going to take you to, Rob, a couple of specific questions. One was in the chat. Do phase DCs still apply to purpose-built rental housing?
They do.
Thanks. And then in terms of this, so this is a question around long-term care, childcare, and social housing. So why are traditional areas for provincial funding now be included in Bill 197, e.g. long-term care, childcare, you spoke about social housing, etc. So why do you think that's been expanded?
Well, it's an excellent question. And it's one of my major criticisms of what the province has done. And I actually wrote to the province on behalf of some clients in response to the regulation proposal in February, where the province proposed to include long-term care facilities, for example, in the development charge. In my view, development charges are intended to fund services that are directly attributable to development that happens within the period of time after the bylaw is passed. And I don't think, for example, development that happens in Toronto over the next 10 years actually creates a need for long-term care over that 10-year period, because the people that are going to be living in those houses that developers are building are not going to be living in long-term care. Also, new housing in the city does not create a need for social housing. Those are services that we should be providing, but they're not directly attributable to development. They're attributable to increases in population, and they're attributable to other economic and social issues that we experience, but they're not directly attributable to development, and I don't think they should be included in the development charge. But I guess the province didn't agree with me.
But now you can all see, if you've seen the build video, why Rob gives the big flex after his big win. So Rob, this is literally the million-dollar question. Do we have an idea of the percentage cap for the CBC? Are we still projecting 15%? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I don't think it's going to be 15%. I think it'll be lower than that, because the province has taken a fair bit out of the CBC, so it stands to reason it's not going to be 15%. I don't even think it's going to be 10%, which is what was proposed for lower tier municipalities. I think it'll be something lower than that, but I really have no idea what it's going to be. As I mentioned in my presentation, Bill is suggesting 2%. You know, we'll have to wait and see what the province decides to do. I just wanted to clarify an answer that I gave before about the freeze on development charges. It's a little bit more complicated than I said. The freeze happens on the date of your site plan application, but if you have no site plan application, then it's frozen as the date of your rezoning application. So it's not necessarily the first one, because if you make an application for rezoning and then a later application for site plan approval, it's frozen as the date of site plan approval. But the freeze, you lose the benefit of the freeze to the extent that there is any benefit if you don't get a building permit within, I think it's 2 years, Max. I don't know if you remember, it's 2 years after the date that it would otherwise be frozen. You got to get a building permit, otherwise you lose the benefit of the freeze.
Yep. Thanks, Rob. That's a helpful clarification. And we've had a comeback also on, it's probably a good time to ask about the interest rates. So the question is, if we apply for zoning bylaw prior to November 1, 2020, will the city just adjust interest? And it's similar to what you've been discussing.
I mean, that's what the city has done. Remains to be seen what they do with interest rates in the future, and it remains to be seen, you know, what other municipalities do with interest rates. I mean, I don't think this interest rate issue is applying, for example, to affordable housing projects, but it's really just the development projects that are like sort of normal commercial development or normal residential or commercial development that the city, for example, is imposing those higher interest rates on, so that they really take away any benefit of the frozen interest rates.
Yeah, thank you. And then, so going back to some of the discussion around hard and soft services. So this question is, it looks like the CBCs can expand hard soft services not covered by the DC as long as the cap is not exceeded. And Rob, you'll recall we had a brief discussion about that during your presentation. And a background study supports the growth need for the services. So is that correct? So as long as the cap is not exceeded and the background study supports the growth, can the CBC expand hard and sought services not covered by the DCs?
I mean, the answer, I guess, is yes, but you have to be able to demonstrate that the municipality has to be able to demonstrate that the services or the capital costs that it includes in the background, in the DC background study, that it's proposing to recover through development charges aren't the same as the capital costs that they're proposing to fund through the CBC. So for the development charge, they have to do a background study that sets out all the calculations in terms of, it sort of sets out the services they're proposing to fund and what they're going to cost, and that's the basis for the DC. The CBC doesn't have to do, the municipality doesn't have to do a background study for the CBC, but has to do a strategy. That strategy also has to set out the capital costs of what they're proposing to fund, and the municipality is supposed to be able to demonstrate that there isn't an overlap between those two sources. I mean, I think that, there'd be no reason for the municipality to shift costs from the DC into the CBC. If they can recover the costs through the DC, they may as well do that, and then and try to fund other things through the CBC. It's going to be interesting to see, what actually municipalities try to fund through the CBCs. I mean, there may be instances where there are prohibitions against certain things being funded in the DC. And the municipalities will instead try to fund them through the CBC, because the rules for how you calculate the CBC are much less restrictive than how you calculate the DC.
Right. So everyone, I know we're running short on time. I've got 2 more questions for Rob, 1 for Matthew and 1 for Max. So we totally understand if you do need to drop off. Our plan will be to address those questions. So if you do drop off, thank you very much for attending. We hope you've addressed any questions. If you have any other questions, feel free to email any member of our panel today. And in the interest of time, Rob, I'm gonna fire 2 more at you, and then Max and Matthew, get ready. I got 1 each. So Rob, in terms of Parkland rates, so the question is, Parkland rates are determined based on the value of land at first permit. Does bylaw 197 outline any consistent way to calculate value of land? Budgeting for Parkland is becoming, here's a true statement, is becoming very difficult, especially in Toronto.
Yeah, the answer to that question is no. I mean, it doesn't really. I mean, we go back to the old rules in terms of Parkland. There is no, there's no change. That Parkland is valued as of the day before the issuance of a building permit if the dedication is being taken under Section 42. So most development in Toronto, that would apply. For greenfield development that's subject to a plan of subdivision, if they pay cash in lieu, the land is supposed to be valued as of the day before the approval of the draft plan approval. Although that provision is now very rarely used, because municipalities try to take land to maximize what the dedication that they can receive, or the value of the dedication.
Right. Yeah, and we've seen changes to OPs looking for land. So this question, and this question will be an item I know that we went back and forth on in regard to various exclusions. So I'll read you the whole question. It's a longer question, Rob, and then when I get to the second half, it's going to ring some bells. Was the previous prohibition on charging CBCs for nonprofit housing, long-term care homes, retirement homes, hospices, universities and colleges, and the Royal Canadian Legion properties removed? And then there's a follow-up. I'll read you them both. The new prohibition on charging CBCs for development with fewer than 10 residential units would seem to exclude many more types of development, e.g. commercial, and Anna, who asked this question, we went back and forth on this, but include larger nonprofit housing developments. So I think it's 2 questions, right, Rob, so go for it.
Those categories of types of development on which CBCs could not be imposed, those were set out in the proposed regulation in February, and the province hasn't indicated whether they are going to continue the same list of proposed exemptions. I expect they will, but we really don't know. So we'll have to wait to see what the province sets out in the regulations. With respect to, yes, the new prohibition on charging CBCs for fewer than 10 residential units, it excludes commercial, that's true, but include larger nonprofit housing developments. I mean, again, I think we'll have to wait and see what the province includes in its regulations in respect of types of development that may be exempt from the CPC.
Okay, Rob, I'm going to let you off the hot seat. And Max, you've got a question on your slide 25. This has to do with inclusionary zoning, site plan approval. And it says, would the agreement, I think this is the agreement with the province, be similar to site plan agreements? Is this reasonable to expect a city to enter into a complicated site plan agreement if they don't want the development? Good thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Anne. That's a good question. I suspect that it will be challenging to get municipalities to cooperate in a open and collaborative way with respect to these agreements, and that's precisely why the province has sort of retained for itself the supervisory power that it did. In particular, as I explained, the province has the power to direct the contents of that agreement. So if you as a landowner is at an impasse with the municipality following the issuance of an MZO that requires a site plan agreement to be made, you can look to the province to resolve the impasse one way or another. The province can step in and direct the contents.
So it's like an MZS. So they're an MSO. They're just going to drop. They have the power to literally create that agreement despite an unwilling municipality.
Exactly. And the question about the scope of the content of the agreement, it's funny, the provisions that are in Bill 197 effectively take the current site plan provisions of the Planning Act and import them directly into the MZO provisions in terms of defining the scope of what can be covered in this agreement. So when you ask whether these new agreements will look like a site plan agreement, I suspect that they will, because the scope of this MZO site plan power really mirrors what the municipality's existing site plan approval power.
So importantly, we're not going to have additional obligations imposed through these ministerial site plans. It's still the same frame of requirements.
That's right. Yeah, the typical exclusions such as matters of interior design are also excluded from this new ministerial zoning order site plan power.
Thanks, Max.
Although I would add that some municipalities take an awful lot of liberties with respect to what they include in site plan agreements now. So I think we'll probably, with the minister involved ordering the entering into a site plan agreement, we may see, you might be able to get away with a more bare bones agreement than a lot of developers face, because the municipalities throw all kinds of obligations in site plan agreements, which are not actually authorized, I don't think, by
Right.
the provisions.
Right.
I remember having this discussion with Rob when I was teaching, when I teach a course up at Osgood, and I'm going through all the case law on this, and I'm like, Rob, this is ridiculous. And so he's very right, and I think we all hold our noses sometimes in order to get our developments completed. So Matthew, I've left you hanging. So your question, it's our favorite, the threat of the bump up. Okay, so is the change in the bump up process coming now or later in the regs, Matthew?
Well, bump ups are always interesting. It was the very first file I ever worked on. But the bump
Hope you weren't bumping up one of ours.
No, it wasn't. The bump up provisions are currently in force. They were both incorporated into the existing Class EA process, in part because they were introduced in Bill 108 and sort of left hanging, and so we're basically refined. But these are also going to continue forward to the new streamlined EA process. Now, how that's going to play with existing bump up requests is a bit of an open question. My suspicion would be that existing bump up requests can continue, but that the minister will likely deny them or point to this new amendment and say that these were the only grounds we're accepting at this time.
Thanks. And Rob, I'm sneaking in one last one. People are working on their pro formas. Everybody wants to know about interest. Will the interest rate be capped, Rob? I've heard this person who remains anonymous has heard that it can be no greater than 1.5 per month, 18% per year compounded. Have you heard something similar, Mr. Howe?
I have not heard that, and the province would have had a great opportunity, and everybody's been complaining about it, trust me.
Yeah.
And the province would have had an opportunity to put a cap on interest in Bill 187, but they chose not to make that amendment. There's one other question that was asked, Anne, and I think, you know, it might be a good way to close off the session, which is how will the actual cost to developers shake out with the Bill 197 changes? Will they be paying more or less?
I saw it. I was saving it.
You know, that's the most important question. And I think, you know, unfortunately, I have to say I don't know. I mean, because I think you have to break it down into the 3 buckets of contributions. For Section 37, it depends on what the percentage of land value is. And, you know, it may well be that some developers, for example, in the city of Toronto may pay more and some may pay less, because right now the way it works is it's what your contribution is, whatever you can manage to negotiate with the local councillor to a large extent. Some municipalities, though, if you're outside Toronto, I mean, suburban municipalities are just starting to use Section 37, and I think once they get the new CDC power, they're all gonna, like, why not use it? So I think we may well see an increased use of, an increase in contributions in suburban municipalities under Section 37. With respect to development charges, I think it's pretty clear that they're going up under this new legislation, because the province hasn't, you know, really taken much out hasn't really taken many services out of the development charge. As I said, some minor ones like parking can no longer be included, but they've increased effectively all soft service development charges by 10%, and that includes, you know, fire, police, ambulance, which you know, not huge amounts of money, but relatively significant. But the 10% increase, for example, in the park development and recreation DCs, I mean, those are significant dollars we're talking about. So I think DCs are going up under these new amendments. And then with respect to parkland dedication, again, it's going to depend on how municipalities respond to the threat of an appeal, and then how developers respond to their new right to appeal. So municipalities may decide, and a lot of municipalities like Toronto and Richmond Hill and others have actually currently do have a cap on the amount of land or the contributions to cash in lieu they take through parkland dedication. And so we'll have to see whether they continue to use those same caps or use reasonable caps, and if they don't, whether developers are prepared to launch expensive appeals to LPAT, and if they do, what LPAT does, because again, there's really no guidance given to LPAT in terms of how to deal with those types of appeals. But again, I think probably what we'll see is, you know, in the Richmond Hill case, the tribunal the board in that case effectively asked the question, is it good land use planning to impose like a maximum alternative rate, and in that case the board said no. So you know, again, remains to be seen.
Okay, thanks, Rob. And so to be honest, this is fun. It's like playing a law video game with all your smartest friends. So I want to thank everyone for attending. We have been recording this, so it is our goal to make a link available if that is technically possible. So I want to thank both Sandra and Lindsay, who've been assisting us put this together and to get this looking hopefully as shiny as it looks on my end. So again, thanks everyone for listening. Special thanks to Rob, Max, and Matthew, and for being on your toes and answering all the questions that have come in. Thanks for sending those questions. And again, we live in interesting times, but the best part about that is we get to come together and try to find solutions together. So we appreciate your attendance, and we're always available for questions and to assist you. Send us an email, give us a call. We look forward to talking to you. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Okay, everybody.
Thanks.